Well, welcome to our next weekend debate programme. A few changes. Most of the tea's gone. We've got water instead. No biscuits. But there you go. But an interesting panel, and we're going to be talking about various things that have been in the news this week. And I thought we'd actually do introductions yourselves this time.
Hello, Kate Lord-Brennan, member of the Legislative Council.
Hi, I'm Dollin Mercer. I have been a multimedia journalist at Manx Radio for just over 3 years, in the process of leaving the organisation.
We'll talk more about that.
I'm Dr. Rachel Glover, Chief Scientific Officer of Taxogenomics, and recently of the DHSC and COVID testing.
Well, I think, Rachel, it's going to be you in the hot seat to start with. Well, in the sense that you haven't done any media, I don't think at all, have you, about what's been going on? You've done your tweets.
Yeah, no, I haven't done any media, and I think just I didn't want to have to cause more trouble, I suppose, or cause more issues for myself if it became an issue where press releases are being sent out and releases against releases, and I just thought, well, let's just settle everything down. And
you imagine though, when those tweets started, that you were going to cause a media storm, or were you not? You were thinking it wouldn't be like that?
I think for me, most people I've spoken to have recognised that somebody in my position doesn't start tweeting about things unless they get to the point where they've tried a lot of other options first to try and get some concerns out. And so for me, I did feel a little like I was, very knowledgeably putting on the flak jacket and sticking my head above the parapet and very much hoping that a bullet would graze the temple as opposed to get me here. So,
where did it end up, do you think?
Probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Well, all feel free to jump in here because, and you don't mind, we need to go back on this.
Sure.
Right to the beginning, how this all started, your involvement with the government, the testing, which you are a world-renowned, it appears.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, that's right. But you know what I mean? You're someone that knows what they're doing.
Yeah, so I spent 15 years working for the British government, developing DNA tests for pathogens and deploying those in various places based on what the government needed us to do at that point. So my experience is very much applied microbiology, and this kind of work is quite specialised in something called molecular diagnostics. And so there's not a huge amount of expertise around the UK. It was quite a niche area until COVID made it a huge issue. So back in March, when everything was really starting to look a little bit hairy in the UK and here on the island, that there would be potential cases here too, I sent an email up to the path lab at the hospital and said, look, you guys have seen my CV before because I did a couple of shifts for them when I first moved back to the Isle of Man 3 years ago. I'm pretty sure I could help you with this, and I'm pretty sure there's ways that my lab of taxogenomics and Onken can help your lab and see if we can get a more rapid test set up for on-island testing, because it was taking 3 days for a result to come back from Manchester. And my previous experience in the scientific civil service in the UK suggested that at some point the Isle of Man would be less of a priority to the UK government than Manchester or London, or we wouldn't be prioritised for testing. So bringing that capability on island seemed like the right thing to do, and it seemed like something that I could very definitely help them with. And so that's what really started it all off.
So when, as media, we were going, when's testing going to come to the Isle of Man? Then one day they said it is here. That was you, was it?
I believe so. I don't know quite what the timeframes were or whether there was concrete plans to bring testing on island before I sent an email, but it was coincidentally Friday the 13th of March, and I sent an email up to the hospital and they sent an email back basically that says this is really good timing because we're just doing our contingency planning. So and the first positive case was the following week. So it was about the right time, I think, that it just landed with them. So.
And before you arrived, the testing was just on the UK. It took 48 hours, maybe longer, to come back, and you were turning it around within the day, I suppose.
It took a few weeks to get everything set up. Mm-hmm. So the way that it worked was that probably by the following Tuesday, the hospital sent down one of the microbiologists from the path lab, I think really to scope me out and say, is she for real? Can she do what she says she can do? And I had a 2-hour conversation with them there, and I genuinely, at the end of that conversation, thought, I don't think they're going to go for this. I don't think they've bought into it. I don't think they realise quite how much testing is going to be required if we get an outbreak here. It turns out I was completely wrong. They had They had clocked it. And the following day, I'd actually already spoken to a lot of suppliers going, look, if I have to sell the Isle of Man government the right machine, the right equipment, what's the list price? How quickly can you get it to the Isle of Man? And the following day, the guy who'd come from the Path Lab to see me rang me up and said, hey, I've got a real-time PCR machine in the boot of my car that we've just found in the government analysts lab. Could you come up to the hospital and show us how to use it? And that's how it all started. From that point on, I was in the Path Lab probably about 100 hours a week for the following month, setting everything up, ordering everything, getting it all set up, because it was a technique that I was familiar with, but that isn't found in hospital labs normally. So that's really, it all snowballed from there.
And the timeline, you were fully committed to that, because you're your private business. I mean, dogs and cats and testing and all that, isn't it? And that's
we do in
as well.
Molecular genetics. So it's clinical diagnostic testing, using exactly these same techniques, but for veterinary inherited diseases, so for animal breeders and for vets. But clinical diagnostics in a hospital lab and clinical diagnostics in the private sector are very, very similar. So we kind of had the right equipment and the right robotics and automation and things. So, a lot of equipment from my lab went up to the hospital lab as well to get everything sorted. And it took about 3.5 weeks before we got on island testing launched.
Come on, what's it been like then? Day in, day out up there at the peak, I suppose the peak of when the testing was being done. Was it really, really tough?
It was tough, but the team up there is brilliant. And, I've said that every time when I've done any press in the last 7 months, that, that team really rose to the challenge of taking on this new technique that they'd never done before, that ordinarily is kind of automated for them, but this is the nuts and bolts version. And they really rose to the challenge. And so there's 6 microbiologists in the hospital that are doing the day-to-day processing of the samples and putting those onto the machine. And then for the vast majority of the time, I was calling the results from the raw data multiple times a day for those samples. And then towards September, we started looking at getting the chief microbiologist set up so that she could learn how to call the results as well, because I needed a day off. But it hasn't really been a case of, there was a large peak of work and then it calmed down, because there was still all of the surgical patients being tested, all of the admissions to hospital. So the lab at the hospital have been working full out for this whole time. And people, I don't think, realise that just because there's no cases on island doesn't mean there's no testing.
Well, I don't want to move it too fast on, but the logical thing is you were part of very much needed. Then suddenly, you're a freelancer. Which didn't go down well with you, I know. No, but seriously, I mean, should we jump to that? Or, is there more to be said about what goes on there? Because I want to make sure we've got plenty of time to talk about it. And you drop in with questions, guys.
I think for me, when this all started and we were in the heady days of working ridiculous hours to get everything set up, the Path Lab were just like, look, how do we pay you for your time?
You started out being on the payroll.
Yeah. And I said, well, one, we need to make sure that I'm insured to be in here. So, it makes sense to have me on the payroll, because then I'm covered by their insurance as well as my own. But I said, well, you can either put me back on the bank, or you can take my commercial rates. And I told them what the commercial rate was, and they went, We'll put you back on the bank. It's fair enough. It was the quickest and easiest way to get everything covered. And I went away and said, look, the pay rate is very, very, should really be, what I'm going to do for you is at clinical scientist level. So that's usually a role that's found in the bigger hospitals. So Manchester, Cardiff, they have clinical scientist teams with PhDs who come in and develop methods and deploy them. So we kind of negotiated a little bit on that, and then that was it from, I put a timesheet in every month.
Yeah, but because they were sending it across and paying whatever rates they had to pay anyway, right? So you were a better option. Or was that too simplistic? You know what you're doing, and you're here on the Isle of Man, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of it was altruistic, because it's my friends and family that would need testing as well. And, my dad's ex-army, my brother's a policeman, I'm ex-civil service in the UK. I think there's that want to help and that need to help if I can. And certainly with the skills that I had, I knew that there wasn't that skill set in anybody else on the island, because otherwise I'd have hired them by now. So it was like, right, here's my skills, I can help you, I can get this sorted, let's get this done and get it up and running.
And if you hadn't come forward, what would have happened? Do you know?
I don't really know.
Would there be somebody else?
I think they probably would have relied on sending away still.
See, this is the major thing that I don't think has been said enough clearly and publicly enough to say that we are so lucky that you had been on the island in the right place at the right time and willing to assist us in a major way to do with managing the response to the coronavirus. And I know I have said it on social media before, but I would say it again, thank you so much. And the fact that you were able to step up and respond as you did and provide such a valuable service is something that we should be super, super grateful for. And that, for me, makes me think of two things. First of all, it is therefore such a great shame that we have actually ended up where we are more recently, because in the early days, decisions needed to be made quickly. People needed to step up to the mark quickly. You and many other people were part of that. Yeah. But actually what certainly I think a number of people would have liked to have seen in the months from that point is to things become a little bit more ready for the next stage. So if there were any issues to be sorted out, for people to be listened to, and for time and whatever changes that needed to happen to take account of those, to move us forward to the next stage. And the other thing that it makes me think about is that actually we are in a position where we are able to count our blessings, and as part of that, and a lot of that is actually to do with the right and good decisions that government were able to make in the early days, but we should be completely valuing our assets instead of having these things that have been flaring up over the past few weeks that have not been inspiring confidence. So it's such a shame, because actually we're in a great position. So it's really unfortunate that the latest developments in terms of your role and your position has gone this way, and it's not just been a seamless integration to take us forward. So thank you, and I think it's really unfortunate in terms of that side of things.
So I mean, I would say thank you for saying thank you. It always makes me feel really uncomfortable when people say thank you. But I mean, the way I see it is that the British government actually spent a lot of time and money over years training me to do that thing, and it's just the Isle of Man's benefiting from that. I think I didn't step away from the DHSC role in an abandonment, effectively. It had been discussed prior to that as to whether I would potentially look at formalising it more as an external contractor. Because when I started and came in and said, hey, I might be able to help you, I thought it might be 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah. And then I would leave them to it and all trained, and I didn't think it would be a 7-month marathon, effectively.
Why aren't they trained? Why could you not train more? You had to go way too far?
It's the type of training that biomedical scientists receive. So they're used to more machines that are what we call point-of-care devices. So you add a sample to it, you put that cartridge into the machine, an hour later it spits out a printout that says positive or negative. And the type of testing that's required for coronavirus in this kind of situation is very, very highly technical. It's a tool that's generally used in research laboratories. It's very, very finicky, I suppose. So that's why in the UK what they did was centralise all of this testing in lighthouse labs rather than giving each district hospital a machine to do this with. So it's trying to bring the same principle here, and they are trained in running the technique, but it's about calling the results.
And now you've stepped away, life goes on, but what's missing with you not being there?
At the moment, they're calling the results fine, and the lady I'd trained before I stepped away is calling the results every day. But what's happening at the moment is that we're actually negotiating for me to effectively go back to doing exactly what I was doing before, but as an external contractor. So all of those negotiations are in play, ongoing at the moment, with the same offer, that I can call results whenever they need me to. We just add it to the invoice at the end of the month, and I become the external contractor that everybody has been telling me I have been for the last 6 months. So,
but, I mean, I spent all the press conference on Thursday. We should get onto that, obviously, and we can come back to you during the whole show here. No, but the timeline seemed very low, slack, whatever. Time was not happening very fast for this, because on Tuesday they found the latest positives, but they didn't release it until Wednesday night. You're rolling your eyes at that one.
Well, I think what has come about, which is really unfortunate, taking account of all the good stuff that was done in the early stages, is that it feels very much like there is a transparency issue now. And this is problematic for various reasons. One of the reasons clearly is a matter of confidence. If people don't feel like there is full and open transparency about whatever is happening, whether it's just to do with the overall response to COVID or whether it's to do with specifics around testing, that's going to create an amount of public concern and perhaps some nervousness, because in the end, it's not actually government measures or legislation that will fight a virus. It is, as Claire Barber was talking about, it's about personal responsibility and personal decision making and how you change, how an individual takes responsibility for their behaviour. So that's why you really need to have open, transparent information, clarity about the direction, and also to not have this kind of bandying about of terms.
It was getting ridiculous, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, what is it in the is it a community transmission or is it not? I mean, it was, but it wasn't by name. And yes?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit confused by it because by the WHO terminology, it isn't community transmission because that is something that you wouldn't know where it had come from. But equally, it very much is on-island transmission. If somebody has contracted it without moving away from the island, without going and travelling, and I think most people on common sense would call that community transmission,
yes,
even if it's not a defined scientific terminology.
Yes, because we've been working on that basis. For example, in April, when the news release or whatever it was came out, March, I think, about closing the borders, the first cases of community transmission were described as the very reason for doing that. So then we had various terms that we would talk about, like community spread, community transmission, and I felt like there was a general understanding of what that was, right? It was a virus passing from one person to another where those people had not been away. So to get so specific about what it isn't feels like, are we reaching more desperately to be attached to their being able to say there's no community spread versus actually, walking in openly and honestly to the fact that actually we know that it's just a matter of time before it arises. So, for example, on the front of the Courier this week, it says, the headline, it is a cluster, right? So this brings me back to public health messaging. We should not be surprised or confused or suspicious when this information comes out. Language matters.
I think it's about knowing that if a cluster is identified, you know where it is and you can test everybody around it or you can contain everybody around that. And it doesn't mean that you're going to go into Tesco and contract COVID by just being around other people. Those those terminologies and the contact tracing and everything like that, it does work. If we know for sure kind of where people have been on that contact tracing, and you can say that it's contained.
The Chief Minister, I think, likened it to the cluster in Guernsey, didn't he? And spoke a bit about how they weren't sure of the provenance there, whereas we were here. I don't know if that has any impact on how it was defined.
I think it comes down to sometimes the accuracy of the testing. So the test that's in place in Guernsey does have a higher false negative rate than the one that's used here.
What, they're not on the gold standard? I'd love to know about that as well.
So what we describe as the gold standard here is the fact that we test for the swabbing. So when you have a swab taken, it collects human material as well as potentially virus. And so what we do with the test here is that it tests for that human material, and if it doesn't find enough of it, then we know the swab wasn't taken properly. So what that helps us to do is say that when a test is negative for the virus, it's negative for the virus because the virus genuinely wasn't there, rather than negative for the virus because you didn't swab properly. Right. So that's where ours differs from a lot of jurisdictions. Wales are doing it this way, but
you still can get a negative, positive, negative, and all that sort of thing, because
you can, but
that guy that was in the private sector got one that was wrong in the end, but they said it wasn't the gold, and then David corrected to me by saying it was the gold. So I'm going, so best of three maybe?
No. It's much more complicated than that, unfortunately. Right. So the gold standard is PCR. So PCR is the method by which we detect the virus or don't detect the virus. what happened with that false positive is that the private labs in the UK, which are known as Pillar 2 labs, so there's different pillars in the UK testing. So Pillar 1 is the NHS labs, Pillar 2 is the private companies who are contracted by the UK government to carry out testing. The Pillar 2 labs had been not very great at calling their results properly, so low positive results were not being repeated. They were just calling them as positives. So that's where the false positive rate was higher in the Pillar 2 testing than it was from the Pillar 1 testing. Because in a hospital lab, like the testing we have here, if you get a low positive, the first thing you do is you repeat it and you make sure that it's not a false positive. So a false positive never appears twice from the same sample. It's a very rare thing, and if you see it, it's never reproducible, and that's how you know it's.
She should be at the press conferences, right? I mean, these sort of things would just help us all, wouldn't it?
I think so, because we've moved on. So I would say, has it reached a point for us now where we've moved beyond the original response, right? So we shouldn't be acting quick. Is it right that actually, I mean, we hear every week at the press conferences that the Council of Ministers had made a decision that morning, and then that's announced, by maybe 2 or 3 ministers. And then there will be questions about what the scientific advice is, what the medical input is. And it's great to see Henrietta Ewart as a Director of Public Health having more visibility now, because I think that's really important. Now.
Because Guernsey, of course, is led by the doctors and clinicians, don't they? They put them in front of the cameras all the time.
And I think that was actually, you'll know, Paul, that in October Tynwald, there was a lot of pushing and a lot of questioning about the role of public health in all of this. So I would say, have we reached beyond the point that the original response, which was decisions being made in quite a closed way, being put out there to the public by individual politicians, have we actually moved beyond that point now, and actually we need a bit of a restart? Because when you hear Rachel and you hear Henrietta Ewart talk about things, it gives them a different perspective, and I think it'd be helpful to have that greater transparency, because it's at risk now, and has been for some time, about being, it's about political personality, isn't it? And actually, we've got to think about how this is going to play out maybe in the next few months. So would it be better to have a different formatted, response to the approach?
I keep calling it presidential, but I'm sure they don't like that. But it looks very podium-y, doesn't it?
It felt right at the time, scripts. I think, when we were in the peak emergency. The island was tuning in. You're right, that was then. I mean, I would call for a different approach that allowed space for 2 things, primarily. It would allow space for the medical input, the scientific input, and that to be transparent, but also it would allow space for the political decision making with enough time for what I in Legislative Council, another matter called early and diverse political input, because you need both. And if you had a different way of handling things, proper focused public health communication, you could avoid many of these, I would call them flare-ups, that we've had about the 7-day testing. That has been questioned. The basis for that has been questioned. And then after that, we had the real unfortunate, in my view, mishandling of the whole issue of Rachel's role. And that was just embarrassing. And then we've had the questionable nature of COVID test results. And we need a reset now. And I think that if there was space for more voices, even if it was other MHKs, more transparency, that's where we need to go for the longer term.
Let me ask, the reason I said I'll come back to Dollin, he's in this very weird situation. He's been a journalist, you're now going to the dark side. Let's put it that way, right? So you've been quiet today, and I think this is not your normal, maybe this wasn't the best week to have you here, I don't know. But you can't do this soon, because you are going to be working for government, aren't you? So.
I have accepted a role working in the civil service, which starts at the end of this month.
So you'll be completely strangled then.
Well, yeah. I think I'm still employed by Manx Radio, so I'm still a Manx Radio employee.
Well, what's your spin on these press conferences then? You okay with that one? Or be careful.
I've had quite a sort of backseat in my professional capacity. I think I had 1 cameo appearance at a press conference, but largely speaking, I've been.
You were in the room.
Sorry, no.
The days of bringing the. Oh, no. Sorry.
I had one over Zoom, I think, but largely I've been removed from it, and so I can. I've been a bit of a a bystander, I suppose, and watch and listen like everybody else. And I feel like I'm doing that again a bit now. It's good.
Well, it's credibility. Let's try that. Credibility at the press conference. It's been. I mean, you got the diehards, and I have to go say so who will write in and say nice letters. But overall, you want, when they go on camera, you want them to tell the truth, but you want them to do it in a way that you believe everything they say, and everyone can move on from it. And you've caused that distraction because you're sitting there making a tweet that can basically lob a bomb right in the middle of that.
Yeah, I don't really see it as that.
Have you felt heard though before that point? I think that's what you were saying earlier.
I think that was, I think I'd definitely gone down the more official routes of trying to speak to people for a long time before going down that route of going, I'm getting really frustrated here, that this is, we don't seem to be listening so much to the science and the medics as we were. And certainly that was the feeling inside the hospital, and a lot of people were actually saying to me, hey, they're not taking our advice, or they're not listening to us, or we send the advice up and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And I was in a unique position of effectively going, well, I didn't ask for this job and I didn't need this job, so maybe I can speak up a little bit more than anybody else who would be fired for doing that. So I think from my point of view, really, I was putting on that flak jacket, not just for me, but for a few others that were struggling to be heard as well. And
so when you say heard, is it that there were certain things that were, you would, with all your experience, certain things that you would expect just to work? You talk about, I'm not a clinician. I don't know about how it. I've got personal experience working
you're in government, aren't you?
I'm not in government.
Well, you are a member of Tynwald. You're a member.
Well, there's a difference there. I'm not in government.
Not in a department, I know. Yeah.
But when you say sending things up, what wasn't working that you think should have been working?
I think communication between the gold, silver, bronze structure that's in place. So one of the things that I did when I was in the UK in the Scientific Civil Service was I was involved in counter-terror response for white powder packages, suspicious substances. And that had a very defined gold, silver, bronze command structure through the police and the Home Office. And so I've seen that working in a very, very efficient way. And one of the conversations I had earlier on in the year with David Ashford was, I don't think this is particularly working the way that I expected it to work. As efficiently, you would expect that information to go to bronze and it immediately go to silver, to gold, and decisions to come back down again quickly. And there had been, I think there was just one incident where basically there was a lot of meetings that happened and not very much action. And the action potentially really should have been happening while the meetings were ongoing. And I felt that hadn't worked very well, and lessons hadn't been learnt from a similar situation. So things like that, I think, from my perspective, maybe having never worked for the DHSC properly, having never been inside the NHS, to look from the outside in and go, I don't think that's quite working the way that I would have assumed it worked even from the outside. But in my experience of government in the UK, wasn't working in similar ways either. But I wasn't on bronze, I wasn't on silver. I was only seeing it from the perspective of somebody operationally on the ground, of have things taking longer than perhaps they should because of decisions needing to be made.
Should we be worried? I mean,
I don't think so.
Didn't you say that? Yeah, but that means they haven't got their organisation in place. They haven't got all the ducks in a row.
The things have happened, and it's just that things happen in a typical Manx way, I think. I think I don't think people should be worried at all. Because obviously we're sitting here, 4 of us around a table. There's no masks. We're not socially distanced.
Yeah.
We're,
and it is such a positive. We have to remember that. But our job in the press conferences is to take them to task. I mean, that's what it should be. I don't know if they want that to be the case. I think they want a love-in personally, and they don't necessarily like the questions. And do you think it's a struggle when you listen to it to hear what's coming out to define what you want to hear?
I think if you gauge what you read in terms of public opinion, certainly a lot of listeners and readers, Manx Radio have commented that they're getting fixated on some of the sort of side issues that, I've forgotten the word you used now, but there have been a couple of rifts that have happened through the process which have almost captured people's attention more than perhaps some of the
and that does happen, though, doesn't it?
More important things, that messages that that's purely going on what people have said on social media off the back of some of the conferences and things.
And I think certainly I've found it very strange that something that I've almost innocuously tweeted about has become a major news issue. And you just think, well...
And you didn't want us to talk about you, did you? You actually said, don't talk about me in these press conferences. But you were, because you are becoming the story, which shouldn't be the case. And I think you're absolutely right.
But it's about personalities. This is how it's become, whereas there's been, a pandemic plan that was... was live apparently as early as, so as late as sort of February this year. And I'm not sure whether there is like further iterations of that, but it says that, that communications should be led by public health. I mean, I feel quite strongly that when we're dealing with a health crisis, a health emergency, whatever you want to call it, actually the leading messages should be public health ones. And then, of course, politicians, ministers will have very, very important things to say. But are we at the right stage where actually we're expecting a nation to tune in every week on a Thursday and get the lowdown put across in that way from ministers? I mean, it was right at the time, early days.
Who would you have fronting it? I mean, and it's obviously the Chief Minister at the minute. He's head of the country. But who'd you be your ideal lineup?
Well, I think that you probably need to differentiate between messages that are to do with public health and actually what society needs to do, and put those forward clearly and in multiple ways. So if we're talking about actually, people need to think about shielding potentially, or washing their hands, or wiping surfaces, that sort of thing. And then I think separately, we don't really hear from these news conferences and ministers come out and express clearly what an overall strategic approach to handling COVID-19 is. So I think you've got different ways of communicating depending on what it is. But at the moment we're mashing it all together, and we're talking about updates in the UK, updates from the US elections, and is that really what this is about now? I think we need a refresh.
Come on, Dollin.
I suppose. I mean, I obviously can't have a view really on what's right and wrong, but you could say that the content of what's spoken about in the briefings has broadened, probably, hasn't it?
We're talking about the elections here and Brexit again. And
I can't have a view on how those are structured really, but if you look at, it was mentioned before, look at what happens elsewhere in other jurisdictions, who delivers the message depends upon what's being delivered. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
We spoke about the Channel Islands. I think it's the same in other places too.
Let's talk about one particular thing. This letter, the letter. When you were listening to that press conference, were you?
I actually didn't listen to it at the time. Because I resigned on the Tuesday night, and I emailed the Path Lab staff that I've been working with on the Wednesday to say, I've resigned, and it's absolutely nothing to do with the stellar job that you guys have been doing, and it's, hopefully I'll be back as an external contractor. I knew that there was going to be a briefing, and I thought, okay, it's bound to come up. Once it's made public, it's bound to come up. And I didn't expect that, though, but I didn't want to listen to it at the time either. So I decamped myself, and it was really when somebody had put something on Twitter going, it's something about Rachel being hung out to dry or something with an anonymous letter, and I thought, what? That's got to be a joke, surely. And then I started getting messages through from the Path Lab, very angry messages from this Path Lab going, it's nothing to do with us, please, for the love of God, we haven't done this. And I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to listen to the briefing. So I went back to my office, and I sat and I listened to it up until.
And what do you think?
My immediate view is exactly what I put on Twitter. I'm a bit too honest and open, I suppose, which is that I didn't think that it could be from somebody who was directly involved in the testing, because they would have known what my involvement was day to day. But equally, if people are absolutely entitled to write a letter to whoever they want, and I have no problem with that. A few people have said to me, do you think the letter is real? I was like, well, I don't know. There's
been a lot of speculation about that, but I do have to think David Ashford is an honourable person. I can't imagine him doing it, but everything's out there, isn't it?
Yeah, my personal view is everybody is entitled to write what they like, and my annoyance was more that obviously whoever had written that letter had agreed to a politician reading it out at a national briefing at a point where I wouldn't be able to defend myself, and perhaps if they were giving that permission, they didn't know how it was going to be used. I don't know whether it's just me feeling a little bit stung by it, but it certainly felt a little bit like it was being used to discredit me, which was unfortunate. But ultimately, I have no control over what's said at a national briefing. So, I just have to roll with the reaction to that. And I could have gone down the route of press releases and everything like that. And I just thought, do you know what? No, I'm not going to give it oxygen.
Well, it's tit for tat, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's become that. And I just think with these things that are being, that are playing out at a national level, at a national media conference.
And it shouldn't be the focus.
It shouldn't be the focus. And actually there's loads of other things that we could be talking about. Like, for example, let's have a good conversation about testing. Should we be testing more? I think a lot of people would say yes. And actually instead we've come down to a level where it's about personality, it's about PR, we're focusing on the wrong things, it's causing anxiety where there should be confidence because we're in a really fortunate position.
Well,
it's a shame.
Yeah, let's talk about testing then. I mean, what's your views on the testing procedure now for the island-wide? What, if you were the person in charge, how would you deliver? And what would you deliver?
Obviously, I have inside information of how much testing we're capable of doing, and the
Can you answer that? How much can we do?
More than 1,000 for sure.
Per day?
Yeah.
Right, I think I've only said 800, but I may be wrong. But okay, so you can do 1,000.
There you go. Yeah,
it depends on.
Have they got the gear? Have they got the stuff? Because I heard there was a shortage the other week. That's another thing. But anyway, sorry, I'm taking you away from you're going to tell us how to do this. No.
It really depends on a lot of things. There's the staffing considerations in microbiology, things like that. There's the amount of swabs that we have on island. There's the amount of people that you have to take those swabs. All of those things have to be taken into consideration for how many tests we can do a day, which is why you might get different figures from different people as to exactly how many tests we can do. Theoretically, if swabs weren't an issue and the people to take the swabs weren't an issue, the number would be a lot higher because it's then a laboratory throughput issue.
But we're not testing many people, are we? I mean, I just thought generally we're not.
No.
See, it was test initially, just like the UK.
Yeah.
Now we don't, or have I missed something?
I think we are one of the few jurisdictions in the world that has spare capacity that is not testing with it, so most jurisdictions around the world are crying out for more testing and they haven't got capacity, whereas we're in the opposite situation where we have capacity and we're not doing a lot of testing. But then we also don't have a large community outbreak, so it's more that the capacity is there should we need it in an emergency. So let's say, for example, that hypothetically we do end up with a cluster like Guernsey and we need to test 2,000 people very rapidly. We have the capability to be able to do that rapidly. But that doesn't mean that we should be testing 2,000 people every day. And I think that's got to come from a very planned out and well thought through strategy.
Yes.
So, and that's where public health do come in because, Rizwan Khan is the medical microbiologist at the hospital. He's the consultant doctor who plans out the strategies within the NHS. He has a very big role in who we test and when and how people, many times people are tested.
See, that's
not
not apparent to people. That's not, it's not apparent to the public. It's not apparent to more members. I think there's a lot of stuff that feels like it's happening in the dark. We feel like we could be doing more, but because there isn't to our knowledge, it's hard to see what the thought is around that. Could we be doing something more with testing? Could we have a better strategy? It feels like we're still reaching when we should be in a position where some of that is becoming clear, if not for now, if not for before Christmas, but certainly when we get to the other side, because we need to be thinking about how we're going to, we can't stay in this position forever.
And what about the students? Have you got a view on all these people? Because they're almost been set aside as like this big army of people going to come in with COVID almost.
I think they're getting a really raw deal at the moment. I was a student for many years, and I do think that there's a certain element that the people on the Isle of Man going, no, we can't let the students back, or they shouldn't be trusted. And well, they're pretty intelligent people. They're they're 19, 20, 21 years old, but they're not daft, and they don't want to bring COVID back to the Isle of Man any more than anybody else who would be travelling off island and coming back. So I think certainly on social media they seem to have been given a bit of a raw deal, and I think we should give them a bit more credit. Yes, they're coming from high prevalence areas and high risk areas, but they're also going to be tested, admittedly by an antigen test, before they come back, if they come back in that main tranche in December. But also we have a great testing service here, so that if they're going to isolation and they start becoming symptomatic, or potentially this is one improvement I would make to the household isolation, is that we actually do some testing on those people in the second week.
Why don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, again, you're asking that question. You're one inside this who knows that's an idea, and everyone seems to be thinking it's the right idea.
Yeah.
You can't.
I think. Well,
okay, sorry.
We should have asked
Yeah.
Dollin this week. He's just sit there.
I'm sure you'll just.
I know he's got opinions, but he can't mention them.
Well, I mean, I think that some of the things is that there isn't really I would like to see evidence of more thought out policy development that would allow for these slight changes and thinking, well, fine, if we do this, we'll introduce some testing here, and then we'll do that to mitigate any other risks. Because I think that in the rush, getting back to the early days, in the rush, there was, in the emergency peak, there was little chance for that proper policy development before, for example, regulations, came out, and that showed itself in various issues, possibly to do with things like repatriation. Now, we're not in the position now of that pressure, so we should have to be able to take account of these things,
There's a clinical group at the hospital who meet. It's all the senior hospital consultants, and they do talk about COVID for part of that meeting. And part of the negotiations that I'm in at the moment is my role on that clinical group as well going forward, and having that scientific input to that as well. I've presented to that group in the past about testing on island, back when we got the on island testing sorted out, and I think that group has evolved over time, and it does feed into the response. And I think the politicians perhaps need to ask more questions of that group. So if they want advice about a particular issue,
and they're not.
Which politicians though? Because when it comes up in Tynwald, for example, we just hear the same. Well, we hear from the clinical and the medical advisors, so it's not clear. That just, to me, it's this
faceless people.
It's opaque. So, I mean, I would love to have more transparency around all of that, because it would help inform decision making and understanding.
Everyone wants that. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that kind of clinical group, if it's phrased as something like an advisory group or something like that, if it's kind of almost rebuilt from where it is now as an advisory group, then I think a very, very good thing would be for the health minister to sit on that group for an hour once a week and actually come in and speak to the scientists and hear it from the scientists and the medics themselves, rather than through the communication channels of writing briefing papers or writing papers. They actually can ask questions in real time and go, well, if we did a decision about this, what would the advice be? And they, David Ashford or anybody else who's involved in that decision-making process could actually access those medics in real time, rather than through papers or questions that might take days for answers to be formulated and come back. I think having that really direct line of communication can only be an advantage, and that's certainly something that I saw in DEFRA in the UK. I worked in the plant health side of things on pathogens there, and if the chief scientist for plant health in the UK needed to ask a question about PCR testing, they would ring up Jenny, who sat next to me, and ask her questions about PCR. If they needed questions about sequencing, they would ring me, and it would just be a direct line of communication. They would get their answer within 5 minutes, and there wouldn't be 3 lines of communication, ups and downs and letters written. And I think that really is, that kind of efficiency can only be to the benefit of everybody else.
I think just coming back to what you were saying about transparency, not speaking as a journalist or as anything else, but just as an interested member of the public, there are a lot of things I've heard this afternoon which I hadn't heard before, and we're what are we, sort of 8 months in, perhaps, since the kind of first case, I think. So what you can say is, if 2/3 of the year later on we're still learning and hearing new things about this process, that in itself is interesting, I think.
But also, I mean, science works like that as well. So I mean, people sometimes misunderstand the science, and even medics. Medics are very much of, one doctor can give an opinion and another doctor can give an opinion, whereas science is more, we're there to produce the facts that inform those opinions. So, and that's what science as a process is. But that also means that a scientist can say something one day and they get new data, and then they say something else about the same question the next day. And so, as we've learnt more and more about this virus and about the way it is transmitted and the more research information comes out, that can change the opinions as well. And I think it's difficult for the public sometimes to understand that what we were saying last month might be different this month. And they see that as a mistrust of science, but actually it's just we formulate our opinions based on the data that we have.
I think going back to the briefings as well, lots of journalists from across the different media outlets have been criticised for repeating questions or for going over the same ground.
I think that's really unfortunate, by the way.
You have to ask the question because things move on and you don't get an answer necessarily.
The point I was going to make was the answers change a bit to the same questions too, I suppose, or have done. Not always, but sometimes.
Can I ask you, would you keep the borders shut? I mean, with where you're looking at, because you're looking at it in a way that isn't political. You're looking medical, and I think that's fascinating because you're looking at the risks and the things. And okay, we have taken into account the economics of the island and that sort of thing. But purely from your science side of things, how would you rate it?
I think, I've been asked about my opinion on border testing before now, and people have always said, oh, Rachel, you're against border testing. And it's not that I'm against border testing. I'm only against it if it's the only test that you do. So if we followed, say, a Jersey-like approach where you test people on arrival, but then we did nothing else. They were just, if they were negative, they could go and do whatever they liked. That's a really high risk because there is this incubation period, and that's what doesn't get factored into a lot of the conversations.
And just doing 0, 5 and 10 now. They've brought down to 10 days. They're doing it at the moment. They've got lots of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I did a presentation to Tim Ward 2-3 weeks ago.
Oh, I'd like to see this presentation.
It was excellent.
I'm going to do it on YouTube. So.
Oh, perfect. Look out for that.
But it wasn't a briefing. It was just a basic science of it. But one of the graphs that I put up there was a very lovely graph that shows an increase in the viral load, and then after a certain number of days, the viral load decreases. And then I put up the graph of 92 actual patient data from that, of their test results for positive and the amount of viral load. And it's a big mess. And that's because we all have different immune systems. We all have different points at which we're exposed to the virus. And we all have different previous exposures to viruses that might affect our immunity and how quickly we develop the disease after we've been exposed to it. So whether you might, for example, get exposed to the virus and then come down with it in 3 days, I might get exposed at the same time and not develop the disorder for 7 days or even 14. So all of that individual variation has to be taken into account, and that's why you get these numbers of kind of 10 days or 14 days isolation. And it's all about mitigating risk. And you're trying to find the thing that fits an infinite number of scenarios the best. And that's why we kind of tend to turn to...
So would you keep the borders closed, or what would you do?
I don't know, because I'm not a politician, and I don't have to take all of that in...
So 14 days... That is the gold standard for finding it. I mean, that will do it definitely, will it?
You will still have cases where people will be positive and infectious after 14 days, and that's those outliers.
So there's no guarantee that you've done your 14 days. You're literally completely clear.
What we can do is we can look at a number of cases, and we can look at the statistics and the modelling and say, well, say if we tested at 7 days, the modelling that we've seen shows that we would detect a positive 94% of the time. So, that means that 6% of people haven't quite gotten through their incubation period enough and to develop the virus enough to test positive, but maybe at day 9 they would. But at 14 days, that rises to 99%. So you're still potentially going to get that 1 in 100 that would test positive at 15 days, but might have tested negative at day 13, for example.
If you test.
But that's the thing. It's all about mitigating risk, and there's no black and white answer to a lot of the questions. And that full respect to the politicians, because they've got very, very difficult decisions to make in a very large number of grey areas when there's no black and white answer. And that, is why they have those jobs. They have to look at everything, whereas I would only say look at the science and feed that into that process. So for border testing, it's depends on the situation, I think. We're at the moment, we're in a pretty good situation. We're all sat around this table and we can all freely do what we like. If we did move to an open border, I think we would increase risk. We'd have to increase testing to do that, I think. Even if it's just random community testing to make sure that you're not missing cases in the community. But I don't know. I don't think there's a particularly.
But we could
one
test
answer
more,
for
maybe.
that.
Do you think, and therefore have a
so,
little bit
yeah.
more? Because I mean, we were at that stage, weren't we, for 7 days with a test, and you could then go do your shopping and go for a walk. But that's gone again. You still got the thing that relations can't come in from the UK.
Yeah. I mean, at the crux of it, the loss of the day 7 testing without informing the lab. I mean, this is basically what started me tweeting, was the fact that, you know, we in the lab found out about this day 7 testing being dropped during the briefing. So it was a bit like, oh, hang on, they didn't ask us first and we didn't know, and we have to staff this and we have to, you know, do all of these things. But the testing in the second week, if somebody's in isolation for 14 days anyway, testing in that second week, would give us some information, especially now that we have multiple people in the same household all self-isolating together, would give us some information about releasing the whole household. You know, if you have somebody who has, say a student, comes back to the family home, the whole family has to self-isolate. The student comes back, maybe develops an asymptomatic infection at day 7, so they won't have any symptoms, but they would test positive. An asymptomatic person is still infectious. They can pass on the infection to their family members. So by the time that person is infectious, they pass it on to their relatives at day 7, day 8, day 9. They are then all released at day 14 at the moment. And I think if you don't test somebody in the house or the original returnee at some point in that second week, you could potentially have people who could develop the infection from a household contact and then be released from quarantine at day 14. So I think there does need to be a conversation around testing during that second week of people who've returned from the UK, just so that you can.
Is that a conversation you'd like to be involved in? And who would would that be with David Ashford, would it, sort of thing?
No, I think that would happen within the hospital and the clinical group and the pathways, testing pathways that are being set up.
So this makes it quite clear. The government announced it on their press conference that they were changing things, and you had no idea at the hospital.
In the lab, we didn't know.
I think that's the point about decisions being made and then communicated quickly, is because quite often they'll say, or the Chief Minister David Ashford will say, the Council of Ministers have decided this morning that. So, you know, it's pretty short timescale, right, for pretty major decisions. So I guess that makes it harder for everybody.
Yeah, and like from the lab perspective, if a decision had been made overnight, say that they were going to do border testing and 2,000 tests a day were needed, obviously that affects logistics, it affects staffing, affects a lot of different things. So the notice period for that obviously being short then can cause a bit of disarray, because obviously you've got to change how
and that was
work.
difficult. That particular one was difficult because that attracted questions in Tynwald about what the advice was around the removal of the day 7 testing, because again this comes back to confidence, because people want comfort that the professionals with the expertise that are involved have given input to these conversations and these decisions, and it's not just been, you know, just a sort of, you know, we're past knee-jerk reaction now, that's what we should be. So I think it is problematic and it is questionable.
And that does actually lead on to, I mean, it's not really something that I've said as actually the specific reasons as to why I resigned, you know. And I was in conversation with David Ashford on email and said, look, you know, I do actually work for you guys. Like I have a pay slip and everything. And, you know, the constant insistence that because of the way that I was employed as a bank employee, it was very clearly made out to me that my input and my expertise wouldn't feed into those briefings, wouldn't feed into the information going up to Comin. And so that, for me, just felt like an untenable situation. If I was going to be an external contractor and treated as such, then I might as well be one.
And you had this emergency question, Julie Edge asked one in House of Keys, and the Chief Minister, it's about you going. Okay. Were you happy with what you heard him say?
I didn't hear it directly.
Okay.
So don't know.
You should listen to it, because he's never met you properly or something, but it was...
I think of it, yeah. I mean,
46 other people there doing the jobs. It was all that sort of thing.
I think that is a miscommunication possibly from the DHSC upwards, because I think if the people who had been working with me for those last 7 months and had seen what I'd set up and how I was integrated in that team, perhaps it may not have been phrased that way. And I think that there was... maybe a misunderstanding that all scientists are the same, and we all have our own little niche areas and we all have our own little areas of expertise, and so I think, whilst we've got the team trained up, there was still elements where I'm very much needed in that process, and that's why we're going through a negotiation at the moment to get me back in to do the work that I was doing before as an external contractor.
If you don't mind me asking, when did those negotiations start, just to kind of finish the timeline?
Last Friday. And they're still ongoing. The major urgent issue of this week was to continue the supply of test reagents.
Yeah, it's pretty major. I mean, I just think that with the number of these things that have happened, we've spoken about 3 things that really just happened in the past few weeks, is that really we urgently need a sort of reset of how all of this is being handled, to have the transparency, to be clear about accountability, allow space for the experts and political decision making, which is informed. We need a reset to take us through. Otherwise, I worry we're just going to keep something else will arise because we've got we're in a really weird situation.
So though credibility is everything here, and if it's lacking, someone somewhere in government needs to look at those press conferences and think how it's to do it better now.
I think
change
it's the whole thing. Actually, I think if
information to the public, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, that, and also if you take, for example, you touched on briefly about the economic response, probably because that's about money. It was quite clear that you needed to have transparency, a clear group set up. It's clear who the officers are involved. It's clear who the politicians are involved, and they're not all ministers. And there is data and information published with that. Maybe it's because that's so, it's about money and how that is spent, that is required and demanded, that clear response. But why would you not have something that is set up in a clear and transparent way to deal with the health? I don't know whether you think that would work for
I think that's
COVID.
a really good idea. And I think that, obviously in the UK they have SAGE, they have the Scientific Advisory Expertise Group, and the clinical group at the hospital, I think it is really going to be key to that. And I think that's where you would almost find that group. And so what I was saying before about, potentially getting ministers in on those meetings, I think that forms that maybe like a health group around that, where you have the medics and you have the ministers or the politicians who are involved in making those decisions, hearing.
It seems obvious, but maybe something will come out of this. But to finish with, can I just quickly ask you about the vaccine route here, because you must have a view on that. We're all very excited. Anything over 50%, we should be getting excited. We've hit a 90% or something, haven't we? So,
that vaccine is one of a new type of vaccine as well. So it's something called an mRNA vaccine. So there's lots and lots of different types of vaccine. They work in different ways to trigger our immune system to produce an immune response that will protect us for that. It is still a new vaccine. So the data that's been released is basically an independent regulator has looked under the hood of the drug company's data. So it's not the drug company saying these numbers, it's somebody independent who has looked at the data. But ultimately you've got half of the people who were given a placebo, half the people who were given a vaccine. And so it's still early days, because the people who are given that jab don't know whether they got the vaccine or not. And they're just going about their normal lives. And so it's almost, they have to wait for those people to get the virus or not get the virus.
5 years normally or something more?
Normally, yeah. And
so would you take the vaccine if offered to you?
Yeah.
I'll take it then if that's the case. I believe you, totally. What do you think to this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think, of course.
Good.
It's just...
Well, it's early days, isn't it? So they're testing it kind of, what my understanding is in the UK, they're going to be testing it by running, like they usually would, but running the phases over each other. And then there'll be an independent review, and then they'll be able to check that that's fine. But then the bigger thing is, obviously, that's going to have to be decided as to who will get the vaccine. So it's not going to be, I personally don't think it's going to be something that is going to be happening that quick for us here on the Isle of Man. Secondly, if you're protecting elements of society, say over 60s would have the vaccine, if that were to be the case, and of course we don't know what the plan is over here. I'm not sure how advanced plans are with that.
I would imagine it goes down the UK model, I'd guess.
Yeah. But at the moment, if we're saying we don't have any community spread, right, what's the argument for saying we're going to vaccinate? So I think we need to get comfortable with what our overall strategy and approach is going to be over the long term, because how do these two things sit together? that's just my view. I can't comment on the scientific stuff.
I mean, typically what happens is that, at the moment there'll be a document from the UK, something called the JCVI, which is about vaccines and infection, and they decide who would be the priority groups for getting the vaccine first. And so for COVID, that would be, kind of nursing home residents, the staff that work in nursing homes, people who are in very, very high risk groups. But what we don't know about any new potential vaccine is how long that protection is going to last. So we know from having people contracting the virus that their immunity only lasts a few months, really. And that's the data that's come out of the last 6 months. So it's going to take a while for us to know how long the vaccine lasts.
And you've got to take two lots a month apart, and then you wait another month before you're fully ready to go, or something. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's cold chain issues as well. It has to be stored at -70. Which is very, very super cold.
Although the Oxford one that's also on doesn't, and the Russians have come up with one as well. So there's a few.
There's quite a lot. There's
a few out there.
There's 47 vaccine candidates.
47.
This is just the mRNA one that's at -70 is the first one to be showing some data. Yeah. So I think over the next couple of months there's going to be lots of these press releases. And the interesting thing about this is that these are being released, and this data is being released by press release. There's no research paper published yet. There's no actual data release. So I can see why the papers and the journalists are jumping on it, because it's a very big ray of hope, and it's a really, really good thing. But also we have to be a little bit cautious that we're doing science by press release.
How soon do you think it'll be before it is any sort of reality here on the Isle of Man?
I would say the new year, before doses are going to come out, because it's got to get through MHRA regulation first, and even though that might be an emergency regulation, and it still has to do that and then get here and then operationally get it out to people.
On a slight tangent, what's the evidence base behind people kind of getting COVID more than once? Because we've read that a bit.
And long COVID and all these other things there. Yeah.
So the people who've been infected twice, when it's been very, very defined cases, what that's meant is that they've tested positive earlier on in the year. Now, most jurisdictions around the world have been doing genome sequencing of the viruses that were isolated from those swabs. And as time progresses, the virus mutates, and it can mutate between people as well. So we can actually see transmission chains by looking at the virus's letters of code. When they're describing people who've been infected twice, and it's come through the scientific literature, it's very, very watertight, because they've sequenced the virus from the first time they were tested, and they've sequenced the virus from the second time they were tested with the reinfection, and the viral isolates are different. So it's very good science that people have been doing to determine that, but it could come down, and I think I'm probably not alone in a kind of geeky science way of having this opinion, is that those people who've been reinfected twice probably have some kind of rare genomic variant in their own DNA that has allowed that to happen. So whether it is or whether it isn't, there's still a lot that we don't know about that, but certainly when it's been described in the scientific literature, it's very, very good science that's happened to show that.
Okay, just to wrap this up, how do you think we should all be feeling today in the Isle of Man? Complacent is probably not the right word anymore, because there's been this outbreak, but should we feel we're privileged to be in what we're at, or are we on a knife through edge there on things could go wrong at any time?
I don't think we should be complacent. I think we should be fairly confident. I think, we are in a really, really good place at the moment. And yes, there's going to be challenges coming in with students returning and people wanting to travel at Christmas and people going away for hospital appointments. But I think the testing and the track and trace and everything that we've got here, those little clusters will appear and we'll be able to contain them. And I think it's just about making sure that we contain those clusters so that everybody else can continue as normal. And I think there's good strategies in place so far to keep that contained.
I think Dr. Allinson said it was kind of a question of when, not if, we had community cases, by whichever definition you pick, again soon.
And they're going for annihilation or something, wasn't that the word they kept using? Annihilation?
Sounds like
eradication.
Okay. Sounds like Doctor Who. Yes, possible. Is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, scientifically, I mean, I think we'll probably end up with COVID being a seasonal disorder, and because unless every country in the world goes for eradication, it's going to have little pockets of it here and there. But if you've got testing in place, and if you do get somebody who tests positive, and then you test everybody around them, and you contain that, and you do use the social isolation and the contact tracing, it really shouldn't be a problem. You know, we shouldn't have to be in fear of it, because those procedures will protect everybody else from that little cluster going any further.
Yeah, there are people watching this who have probably been at home living in their houses for 9 months, whether how long it's, because they're terrified. I mean, I'm just trying. Is there any reason they should be terrified at the minute here? Can they go out with a fairly high confidence to go to Tesco to get their food and things?
I think they can. You know, and if they're scared, you know, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't just wear a mask and do their social distancing, and, you know, wear gloves and sanitize. And I think people do need to shield for certain disorders. You know, if they've been told by their hospital consultant that they need to stay in, then absolutely they should be following that advice. But I also know that people can get fear can grow, and it can fester, and it can become something that's a little bit more irrational than. Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's a risk, but I think that we are in a good place here in the Isle of Man at the moment.
I've got to ask you more questions now. I mean, it's an old person's thing. You're going to die from underlying health issues. You know, the actual death rate is 0.06 or something, isn't it? You know, if you take the whole population, more people dying from flu, all those things that you hear constantly. I'd love you, because to hear what you say to all those. Are they myths? Are they real? Should we take notice?
I would say to that, I'm not a medic. You know, I'm a scientist.
Okay. I know.
I can't.
It's dribbling figures, though, isn't it? You know, you hear these things. It's only people over 85 or something that are going to most likely get it.
But again, you have to generalise in order to make decisions about things, and everybody is that little bit different. And you know, you can get people with the same health condition that one might get it and the other might get it, and one might fare significantly worse than the other. So, I think it's. Again, these grey areas, there is no black and white answer, and I think that's why I say that
it's risk factors, isn't it? I suppose it's like susceptibility based upon age or environment, or
this may be really stupid. Will we get rid of flu at the same time if we did all this? Because I mean, people die of flu every year normally, and no one says anything about it.
Well, I mean, Australia have just come out of their flu season. They've just come out of winter. So what they found, certainly in Victoria, Melbourne, when they went into lockdown for COVID, they locked out flu as well. So, you know, kind of those transmission chains were broken for the flus and things like that. So one thing that certainly most of the Manx public probably don't know is that very early on in the outbreak here in March, the procedure for sending a sample off for a COVID test to Manchester also involved it being fully tested for all of the other respiratory viruses that could be knocking around first. So if it came up positive for flu, or it came up positive for a common cold or human metapneumovirus, then it wouldn't be sent for a COVID test, because you know what was causing the symptoms in the first place. And I think this was something that people weren't aware of, and certainly there'll have been people out there who are absolutely convinced that they had COVID, and it would have been flu or human metapneumovirus, and they probably weren't even aware that these tests were happening, because they were just sent for a COVID test.
Again, 8 months later since the spring, and I don't think I've heard that before.
You just stay here and keep talking.
I'm too honest. This is the problem. Somebody will shout at me at some point.
I appreciate you coming on. I think everyone would love to hear what you've been saying. I can't understand why you haven't been put up, to be honest. I would have you up, and hearing that from you, like you gave the presentation to Timwell, I think there should be. I know you can do it on YouTube now, but why not? Make it public.
We need more transparency, and we need listening leadership, and we need to feel confident as well with our current situation, but definitely not complacent, because we need to be ready, and part of being ready is understanding all the information that we need from all sources, because I mean, look how much we've heard today. It's probably just the tip of the iceberg. There's just so much more that could be done, I think, to add to the already positive situation that we're in. And we're going to need it.
Should point out, I asked David Ashford if he wanted to take part in the debate.
Today, did you?
He said he's a politician and you're the scientist or something. So
okay.
Maybe we can do it another time. That'd be quite. No, but I think David says things, and everyone, he's always got an answer to things, hasn't he? So he's done himself no harm with these press conferences. I just don't like that letter thing. He made you the enemy. He also made the press the enemy by reading out that letter.
Bad.
It was quite bizarre. But he stands by it.
It's not helpful.
Anyway, we got through this. This is our second episode. It rained a bit. It creaked a bit. It's got dark a bit out there. But I hope you enjoyed what you've seen. Thank you, all my panel, for being here. Dollin, good luck. I mean, This guy's a legend. He was really good. We've been on a panel up at Manx Radio, and he very good, big miss for Manx Radio in journalism, I'm going to say, because you are fair and balanced. That almost sounds like Fox News, but you know what I mean? That's kind of tricky in these days.
That's very kind of you to say, so thank you. I really enjoyed it for 3 years, and I may well enjoy it again one day, I hope, but we'll see. I enjoyed it.
Never seen him in the type before either.
First time for everything. Hey.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
We've all learned something here today, haven't we? And we probably had other subjects we could have talked about, but that was just interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, brilliant. And it needed to be heard, needed to be said.
And what can I say? You picked my programme to come on to, and you won't be edited. That's part of this whole thing. You just talk, you can have a discussion. Can you come back sometime?
I don't see why not, unless the negotiations with the DHS.
Well, I'm not saying tomorrow.
Can you come back, Dollin?
Dollin can't do anything now. He'll be releasing the press releases or something ghastly. I don't know.
See you on the other side, buddy.
It's all very top secret. Anyway, once again, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Please like and subscribe to the Isle of Man TV channel. Thank you.